Let's talk about communication. Communication is not just choose words goodly. It involves how skilled we are at being understood and how well we can understand others. When I was solo recording my podcast, I said this. Good listeners, this is what good listeners do, is they find that understanding, they find that deep feeling or why within someone's speech, even if that person is necessarily not very good at conveying what they mean. I have to agree with myself here. Communication is how good we are at conveying the essence of how we truly feel and how good we are at perceiving the feelings of others. See, beneath everything spoken is a motivation or a desire for something. Sometimes the desire is seemingly simple. Say, I want the dishes done, and I don't want to do them. But even something as simple as this contains multitudes. For one, I could just say, do the dishes to my wife. This will likely not result in the dishes being clean, but in one of the aforementioned dirty dishes being frisbeed across the room at my face. A more skilled communicator might say, do you think you could do the dishes at some point today? But let's go even further and say, the more expanded one's consciousness is, the more aware one becomes of the cause and effect of it all. And now maybe we see our desire for someone else to do the dishes as a product of our resentment at cooking dinner the night before and still having to do the dishes the next morning. This is not a true story, by the way, if my wife sees this. The point I'm getting at is a good communicator is an open channel to the deepest parts of themselves. A good listener can penetrate through the surface level and connect to that deeper part of someone else, even if it isn't very apparent. You see, one's own scope of awareness dictates how deep within our own consciousness we can connect to, ultimately arriving at a place of unity and infinite potentiality. You know, some of the greatest spiritual leaders were also the best communicators because they were able to connect to this place within them of unity, of pureness, and express that through their own individual channel. Unfortunately, so many others are bad listeners, and we just miss the essence of the teaching. This is what leads to such a divide amongst all the spiritual traditions of today. And ultimately, this lack of a true understanding is what leads to the divide between people, between ideologies. We're not able to see the true deep desire of each person, instead are fixated on what we see outwardly. You know, I can be better too, believe it or not. I prefer to talk rather than listen. I mean, look at me now, just babbling on camera to anybody that will listen. I hope you really hear me, and in turn I hope that people really hear you. I think perhaps everyone feeling a little bit more heard is our key right now to a brighter future. All right, hello and welcome to another episode 3 of the Seek and Tell podcast. I am the host of the Seek and Tell podcast, and my name is Dylan McDonald. If all is going well, then you just heard my segment on communication just before this. I hope that I communicated it well enough for it to make sense. I have to be honest, I really didn't want to, just wasn't in the mood to sit down and do this right now, which is weird because it's just sitting down and talking into a microphone. It's really nothing on the spectrum of things that are hard to do. It's quite easy. So I haven't yet sat down and figured out what the pain point is there that's causing me to resist so much. But like most things for me, I would imagine it just has to do with fear of coming out here and saying something dumb. But I have the magic of editing, so if I say something dumb, then I can just edit it out. So why am I even scared? Anyway, I'm glad I'm here, and I'm mostly here right now to introduce my interview with Craig Pearson, who is another MIU guy, MIU being Maharishi International University. Craig has written several books, one on yogic flying, which you might talk about at some point in the future, but I don't know if I'm ready to touch on that so much. But the other one being The Supreme Awakening, which is a really cool book. I highly recommend this to anyone who's remotely interested in spirituality out there. But I got to say, for my own personal experience, the thing that really got me into spirituality, and that's such a broad concept. I almost feel bad overusing that term because I think it does kind of get overused. You know, like what does it mean? It means so many different things. What is spiritual? What isn't spiritual? Because you could argue that everything is spiritual. But anyway, I'll use it in this case. What really got me into spirituality originally was when I was in my first rehab. Someone let me borrow The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. Maybe I'm saying his name wrong. Maybe I've been saying his name wrong this whole time. Is it Tolle? Is I don't know. Anyway, you guys know who I'm talking about if you've read it. Most people who are marginally interested in spirituality probably know who this guy is. German dude, kind of writes about being present. But the one thing he did in that book that changed my paradigm with how I viewed spirituality as a whole is he connected he quoted from multiple traditions. And I had been brought up, not specifically and consciously taught this, but sort of unconsciously taught that these different spiritual traditions are all disconnected and are not similar. They're in fact oftentimes opposing. This is what I thought. So Christianity, he'd quote something from Jesus, something from the Bible. He'd quote something from maybe a Sufi. I don't exactly remember. It's been a long time since I read the book, but I just remember seeing different quotes from different traditions, and they all are relevant to what he was talking about, which was sort of the value in being there in the present moment. And it was the first time I really opened up to this idea that maybe these different teachings aren't so different after all, and that at some root level they are maybe even all the same. So this is what Craig Pearson more or less does with his book The Supreme Awakening, is he, through the Vedic science perspective and through the higher states of consciousness model that we have of, like, fifth cosmic consciousness being like the fifth state of consciousness, and then God consciousness, and then unity consciousness, which, you can think about these as like stages of enlightenment, more or less. And Dr. Travis, in my first episode, talked about, he mentioned them briefly. I don't think he went into a lot of detail about the EEG patterns, but there are specific markers that we see in EEG for these, at least for the fifth state of consciousness. The other ones are kind of still a work in progress in terms of very specific markers of this is the sixth state, this is the seventh state. But anyway, Craig Pearson, he, using this model, he finds people from not just spiritual traditions, but just, athletes and poets and writers, artists from all around the world in all different times. And he finds quotes that they did that he's like, look, they're talking about this state of consciousness right now. And he does this all to show that uh, that this isn't this model is not exclusive to those in the TM community, to us weirdos here in Fairfield. It's a universal experience, and it's a natural human experience, as he will say. And I just think that's great. That's beautiful, because that's really what we need. And to harken back to my earlier segment about communication, it's a deep understanding that I feel like we need to cultivate within the world, because we're so stuck on these surface level values oftentimes. And we're conditioned to focus on these surface level values. I was speaking to Craig Pearson on a different occasion, just earlier today, and I was talking about how the media the system of the media is designed to prey upon the stresses of the individual, is designed to grab the part of the individual that is attached to, or that is fearful of a certain issue, hot button issue in the world, and they exploit that to further attach the individual to the surface level, very choppy waters of difference versus the shared, even from a non-spiritual point, but as like I said earlier, maybe nothing is non-spiritual, but from a more surface level point, it takes people's focus away from even our shared humanity, or in the country of America, our shared Americanness, Americanacity, Americanianness. I don't know, but you know what I mean. It's we're so focused on the differences, and this is a product of poor communication. It's poor listening, and it's poor expression, because it's not an expression of unity, of oneness. It's an expression of differentness, and it's dividing people versus uniting them, which is not evolutionary. So therefore, it's we would say this is wrong action, wrong communication. But what's right communication is this interview with Craig Pearson coming up. So I will stop talking, I will stop communicating, and I'll go ahead and cut to the interview. I think it's a good one, and I hope you guys enjoy. So thank you very much, and I will see you after the interview. Bye. All right. Hello, and welcome to another interview, hopefully of many. I have a very special guest today. Well, all of my guests are special. This one's very special. And so let me introduce him. He is a man of many talents and much wisdom, author of several books, including The Supreme Awakening and The Complete Book of Yogic Flying. He's a name often heard around the halls of MIU. What does he do? A little of everything, I guess. Want to know what Einstein and Emily Dickinson have in common? Just ask this man. It's Mr. Craig Pearson. Welcome.
Thank you, Dylan. Wonderful to be with you.
So what do Emily Dickinson and Einstein have in common? Or maybe we'll answer that a bit later. Um, we met for the first time a few weeks ago, where we had lunch, and you were very curious about my story, and I feel like I went on for so long telling my story. So now I'd like to turn the tables on you a little bit and ask, just for a little bit of your story and your journey in finding your path and where you're at now, finding TM and all that stuff, and start from wherever you like, include as many details as you would like.
Yeah, when I reflect on my own journey, I don't find it particularly fascinating the way I found your journey, Dylan. Um, I was born and raised and grew up in the western suburbs of Chicago, so just a sort of suburban middle class, basically trauma-free, upbringing. But I came of age a long time ago for many listeners in the 1960s, which was the era of the Vietnam War and protests and the era, the birth of rock and roll really, and it was a very exploratory time, a time of questioning the system, questioning just that, questioning the system, and I was very much influenced by that, and I went into college at Duke University, but all along I knew that I wanted to do something that wasn't just being a cog in the wheel. I didn't want to be part of a system that I perceived as largely corrupt. I wanted to do something that was going to be permanently meaningful to me and was going to make a difference in the world. And I think a lot of people today, especially, resonate with that. I have a vague memory of when I was young, 10, 11, 12 years old, my father saying to me this point that people only use, scientists estimate that people use only a fraction of their potential. And I wasn't familiar with the term cognitive dissonance at that time, but that was what I experienced. Like, wait a minute, how is this possible that there would be potential and you don't use it? So, on some level, as I vaguely remember it, I thought to myself, all right, I'm going to try to figure this out. And shortly after I graduated from college, I saw a little advertisement in the Chicago Tribune for a lecture downtown in the city on transcendental meditation. And I'd heard the term TM. I didn't really know anything about it, but I thought this looks interesting. And the announcement said that the person speaking had recently given a course on the science of creative intelligence at Stanford University. So that immediately gave credibility to it to me. So I went down there with a friend of mine, and it was in the ballroom of a hotel, and there must have been 450 people there, huge. Great presentation. And I remember even then, this was like 1971, so a long time ago. But even then, some of the first research studies had come out and they were put up on a screen. And I remember thinking, okay, there's something empirical to this. There's something objective. So I learned along with the woman who I would later marry. We learned at the same time, and we were practicing TM, together, and that was great. But I still wasn't sure what I was going to do in my life. And my father wisely said his mantra for me was, income is the central fact of life. So you need to generate an income. This is, a practical father. And that wasn't something I was interested in hearing. I wasn't interested in income for income's sake. If income were to come from what I was going to do, then great. But I didn't want to just go find some income. Finally, after a couple of years of meditating, the thought occurred to me. Actually, my wife to be and I, we briefly thought we would be Waldorf school teachers. So we went to Germany for a year to study Waldorf education in Stuttgart, where it all began. But it became evident that we weren't going to do that. Anyway, the thought finally occurred to me that I thought, you know what, I could teach transcendental meditation. That would be something worthwhile to do. Even if it's person by person, it's not making some seismic change in the world, but even person by person, that's a worthy project. That would be a life well spent. Teach them how to dissolve their stress, give them a technique for expanding their creativity, growing to enlightenment. That sounds good. So then I went to, my wife had preceded me going to a TM teacher training course. So I went, and it was 6 months at a resort in southern France, last few months at a resort town in the Alps of Switzerland. So best time of my life ever, with a few hundred people who are just kindred spirits who want to do this thing, not a care in the world. Just we are learning how to teach this thing. It's just fantastic. And then came back to the Chicago area, imagining that I would just teach TM at the center there. But pretty quickly got an invitation to come to MIU. And I was asked if I wanted to come because, again, my wife to be had come back from a course in Switzerland, and that whole group had been invited to come to MIU. And so she was going there, and I had an opportunity, so I couldn't resist it. I'd never considered a career in education, higher education. I was asked if I could make a 1-year commitment. And I'd gone through college, just 3.5 years, but I didn't think of it as like a 4-year commitment. But I thought, can I make a 1-year commitment? So I just felt, okay, I'm going to jump off the edge of the Grand Canyon here and just a 1-year commitment. And that was like, 43 years ago or something. And so if TTC was the time of my life, then being at MIU all these years is the time of the time. I've just had, just unbelievable opportunities that I never would have had elsewhere. I've just met hundreds of amazing people, yourself included, Dylan. I include you in that. Just lots of friendships, so many interesting projects, so many growth opportunities. And of course, there are challenges and everything. There are things that were hard to do. But underlying even the things that were difficult, there's just the joy of knowing this is where I should be. Um, this little thing might be temporarily not so interesting for me, or it might be kind of boring, but I've got to do it. But the backdrop was always, wow, I'm here.
Mm.
And from the beginning and to this day, I wake up in the morning and feel like, wow, I just wrap my arms around this around this campus. So dialing back a little bit, early on in my TM journey, I think it might have been shortly after I learned TM, and again, that was so long ago that my memory is kind of vague. Um, Somebody handed me, or I came across, some little piece of paper with some 4 lines of verse on it. It could have been Wordsworth, something, but it was clearly describing transcending. So even at the beginning there, I thought, wow, here's a person from several hundred years ago who didn't have a technique and they were experiencing transcending. That's kind of interesting.
Mm.
And that made an impression on me. Um, and when I came to MIU, then I had access to professors in different departments, and I just made a point to start asking them, okay, you teach art. You would have read a lot of art criticism. You might have read biographies of artists. Have you come across any artists who described any experience of transcending or higher states? And they'd share with me whatever they had. And ditto for the philosophers, that were here at the time. And I started doing research, um, and it was just really fascinating. And I imagined that Maharshi has this model of higher states of consciousness, 7 states of consciousness altogether, 4 higher states beyond the familiar states of waking, dreaming, and sleeping. So my hypothesis was that if those are natural states, I should be able to find examples of each one of those. It may have happened spontaneously or the result of some kind of practice in the past. And everywhere I looked, they started appearing to me. And I thought, I've got to write a book about this. But I knew that would take a while. And at the time, after being here a few years, I started a weekly newsletter. And I thought, I'll just start publishing these in the newsletter because it's going to be years before I write a book. So I published a few. Every week I would have one. And it got tremendous feedback, those little things, little corner of page 2. And I realized that this is something that resonates with people as deeply as it does with me. So anyway, that's a short story. I could run through all the different things I have done here, but those are the broad outlines of what I've done. And then that led to the book, The Supreme Awakening, and other books following on the heels of that. And but of all of the dimensions of Maharshi's teaching, I'm super fascinated by the idea of higher stages, higher states of consciousness, meaning completely different yet expanded and entirely natural ways of experiencing yourself
Mm.
and experiencing the environment around you. So circling back to the little comment my father made to me at the workbench in our basement or wherever it was, when I was 11, I feel like, okay, I did find a pathway to those higher potentials that were alleged to exist.
Mm. And you established the context in which the pathway that you took, where that fits with everything else and other people's experiences from all different paths and walks of life, which I think is really crucial. And I it's why I commend that book so much, because oftentimes, especially when you're only spending time chatting with other people that are within the same field as you, within the same movement as you, um, you can lose vision of a broader context of things sometimes. And I really love that this book, it first of all demystifies everything, which I think was already to some extent happening with the scientific research. Um, but it demystifies and says, "Oh, actually, this is something that many people like throughout history have experienced, and not all of them had a technique. Some of them it was just a spontaneous thing."
Right.
Uh, so were you interested in prior to learning TM, had you embarked in any type of study of spiritual practices or higher states? Maybe you didn't call it that, but was there a curiosity there prior to learning TM?
That's a great question. Not in a formal way. Um, Again, as I grew up, as I came through college and all of that, I just again I knew that there must be something more. I think most thinking people have some idea that there's something more to life than they're currently
Mm.
experiencing, and that was certainly there. So, along with my desire to do something outwardly that was meaningful and that would fulfill me and create some positive change, along with that outward thing, there was some inner value of there's something more in that vow I'd made years earlier that somehow I'll find it, but I hadn't embarked on any practice. Well, I remember when I was studying in Germany, I didn't mention that when I was in, I mentioned that after I graduated from college, my wife to be and I went to Germany to study, but we also went to Europe for our junior year in college. And I remember being in Germany and going down to the English language bookstore in Munich where I was studying, and there on the rack was a book on yoga. And so, okay, yoga, that looks interesting. And by Ernest Wood, famous writer, I still remember. And I took it home and read it, and the technique there was about like picturing a cow or something and the parts of a cow, and I just thought, no, this is not going to take me anywhere. And so that was that. Um, and then when this ad for TM came along, I thought maybe that's different than this thing. So that's the extent of my formal study. But it certainly did become a formal study, starting with that first little piece of paper that came my way. And I think that one reason, you use the word demystify. I think that, and you can confirm whether this is the case for you, Dylan, or not. But I think one reason that that book and that perspective, that collection of experiences from around all cultures throughout time, I think one reason it resonates with people is it affirms that it's really a universal experience.
Mm.
I like to say to people, this is not a Vedic experience. It's not an Indian experience. It's not a Maharshi experience. It's a human experience. It just so happens that the TM technique, which derives from the Vedic tradition, is a pretty good way and arguably the most efficient way to elicit that experience. But nonetheless, it's a universal experience. And the more I read, just the more deeply I became convinced that this is real. I mean, even at the beginning, I was pretty convinced. Like, how could you become more convinced about something you're already convinced of? But just the ongoing discovery was just a continued affirmation that this is really a universal experience. And there are scholars out there who argue that there's no such thing as a universal experience, that all these different experiences reported in different cultures, they're completely the product of conditioning in that culture, of the language that one
Mm.
speaks, of the culture that one's brought up in, of the values and like the religious iconography, and it's all that. And what they miss is that there's an experience that is completely content free, that is free of all of that. That's the experience of transcending. In the experience of transcendence, where there's just pure wakefulness but no thought, there's no culture, there's no history, there's no religion, there's no ideology, there's no language, there's none of that. And that's just a complete content-free experience. That experience does not get shaped by anything. It will shape the experience in the relative world, but the relative experience does not shape that.
Mm.
And so that argument against universal experience really comes out of a materialistic view of life, that really everything is, even our culture in which we're brought up, is in some way materialistic, and only that exists, and therefore everything must be shaped by that, kind of like saying consciousness is nothing other than the brain. Um, but if there's a state that can be experienced of pure consciousness, then that overturns, I think, logically and experientially that notion that other scholars hold. And so I'm prepared to go to it with anybody who'd like to discuss this.
You're ready to throw down.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
um, and it would make sense that the conditioning doesn't come in the experience that the person has. The conditioning comes perhaps in how they describe that experience, whereas they will
Yes,
people of different cultures and different languages will describe the experience using the language that they are conditioned
absolutely.
to use, which is why if someone was short-sighted and perhaps had a more materialistic paradigm, could not see the underlying message and could only see the surface level values of what the
Right.
person's saying, then you would think, well, this is totally different. What this person's saying, what this person's saying uses different words. It seems to me they seem like they can't exist alongside each other.
That's a very astute point, and that actually happens. Um, Higher states of consciousness might fall within the category of what's called mystical experience. I avoid that word because the word mystical for the last 120 years has had so much baggage. Like any unusual experience could be called a mystical experience. The original mystical experience, mystical just means it derives from a Greek root meaning to close the eyes, with the suggestion of closing the eyes to turn inward. So the core mystical experience would be the experience of transcending. And the great mystics, let's use that word here temporarily, in, for example, the Christian tradition, were people who had clear experiences of transcending, going beyond speech, beyond thought, inward. And even those people had different ways of describing that experience. Some people would talk about, the divine darkness. Others would talk about the Godhead. Others would just say that's the experience of God. And so, scholars of mystical experience, you can see them going in and deconstructing linguistically, unpacking the words. And St. Augustine must have meant this, but St. Teresa meant this other thing because she uses these words. And I'm thinking, you know what, if we could get St. Augustine and St. Teresa and others in a room together and have them talk, they would be all about their shared experience. And they might have used some slightly different words that on the surface, if that's all you've got to go by is the words, you might tease out some differences. And even more to the point might be comparing Christian mystical experience with Buddhist mystical experience, where, in Buddhism, they talk about the experience of non-self, whereas, in other traditions, it's all about the self. So must be a fundamental contradiction. Well, no, there's not.
Mm.
The non-self just means not the small, ego self. But again, I just I love the mental image of bringing folks together from different centuries and just having them compare notes if they could all speak the same language. And it would just be a love fest, I think, just celebrating and resonating so deeply with each other and the sharing of something that they all experienced through whatever technique or path or non-technique, but they all experienced and celebrated.
Mm. In many ways, that's what you've done with the book. Not physically brought them together, but brought their
Right.
messages together. And I think, and I'm going to compliment you once again. I think it takes someone with very broad awareness to be able to see all these things and see the underlying connecting ties within all of them to bring them together, and also a genuine curiosity, which it seems I can tell having now this is my second time having a conversation with you that you have a natural curiosity about you, which it seems goes a long way in your role.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I want to mention there were just some really fun aspects to the project. Maharishi has that expression that what you put your attention on grows stronger. And with my attention on this project, and by the way, the project was never like part of my job description. I always had
Mhm.
like a more than full-time job description. So doing this was like whenever I could find a few minutes here and there. But even so, in the back of my mind, with my attention on it, it was amazing how things would literally be put in my hands practically. Like I remember there was, and I think still is, a mail order company called Land's End. They sell mostly clothing, but other stuff. And we'd get this monthly catalog back in their heyday. And So one catalog was their main thing was cashmere sweaters or some kind of wool that was obtained from goats or sheep in Mongolia. So they sent a photojournalist to Mongolia to do a story about the goats and everything out there. And so here comes the catalog, and the center kind of piece of the catalog is this 4-page photojournalist essay about here are the goats and the shepherds that get the wool that's in our sweaters or whatever it is that we're selling. So I'm just eating my lunch and reading a Land's End catalog and reading this little thing, and right in the middle of it, the photojournalist writing it describes, some moments of unity consciousness sitting out on the steps with David Yaden. You'll find it toward the end of the unity consciousness chapter in a Land's End catalog. Uh, Another time I was with my wife at her grandmother's house in the western suburbs of Chicago. She had this old little house, and up in one of her little bedrooms is a little bookshelf with just old books. And I had hours to spare, so I thought, what's on these books? And one of the titles down in the shadows was Adventures in Contentment. And I thought, well, that looks interesting. Pulled it up off, opened it up, and just right there, I didn't even have to read. Right there, I'm looking at a description of transcending, from the author of that book, who lived in the early part of the 1900s. And like that, when you attend to something, then it finds you in a way.
Mm, yeah.
And the other thing I want to mention is just for every person that I looked at in the book, you'll notice there's like a little bio, a paragraph of them. Yeah, I might read, 3 or 4 sources, even a couple of books to put together 10 sentences about them because I really wanted it to be rich. And besides that, like for any given person, say Helen Keller, I thought, okay, Helen Keller, famous, in the 20th century person for being blind and deaf, basically, since shortly after birth. I thought she might have something interesting to say. So she wrote something like a dozen books. I read all of them. So it was like panning for gold. I read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books, just panning for gold, trying to find the golden nuggets. A lot of pans came up with just gravel and, cast aside, but the golden nuggets, and just put all the golden nuggets for people to see. But in the process of doing that, I just really came to feel like I knew these people, like they were my friends, whatever age they lived in. Didn't matter whether it was Plotinus in the 2nd century AD or Helen Keller in the 1900s, or just like you feel close to them. I suppose you get that from any biography that you might read. But particularly these people who had this core experience, there's something about them that I just felt like, okay, these are my buddies. I really love them. I just admire them, and that was a nice experience to kind of, again, this may be trivial. It may be the experience for anybody who reads history or biography, but to feel like you've kind of stepped outside of time, and the people who are long gone, in some way, they're still just as alive and sharing with you as they ever were. So I had never done that to such an extent before, and so that was another fun part of it.
Hmm. And I would imagine, especially when they're describing this universal experience that you're also having, there's that connective tie
Yeah,
of like, we're also, it feels like there's this timeless aspect of me that I'm connecting to, that is this timeless aspect of this person who doesn't in the physical realm exist anymore, but I'm still
right.
connecting to them through experience, which how many people can say that they connected through experience to like Mother Teresa and
Yeah,
stuff? Not many people.
yeah. Like,
Or maybe a lot of people.
who knows? There could be lots of people.
Yeah.
Surveys. There's a what is it? I forget the university in England, but there's a center at the university that's been going since about the 1970s that um, surveys people, primarily in England, about their spiritual experiences, and they've collected a vast storehouse of data. But they find that spiritual experience, defined broadly, is a fairly common thing. So one of the points I like to make is you don't have to be Helen Keller or Billie Jean King or Ralph Waldo Emerson or you don't have to be the Buddha to have the kind of experiences that they talk about. It just so happened that somehow it was organized that they became famous figures But the experiences that they described are open to everybody. It's a
Mm,
birthright. It comes back to that point that we were discussing. It's universal.
mm,
Anybody has the potential to have that experience. You don't have to be from the East. You don't have to be a mystic. You don't have to retire into solitude, whether in a convent in medieval Germany or, an ashram in medieval Nepal.
mm,
It's just there for you to enjoy.
mm.
You just have to dive within, and there it is.
Yeah. Let go and allow it to happen if it's
Yeah.
such a natural experience. So I mean, you mentioned that all of these, once you started putting your attention on it, all of these things were sort of revealing themselves to you. Do you feel like part of that was not just because it was something that was a need, perhaps a need of the time, but also something that was dharmic and very personal to you? Do you feel like
Yeah,
in
well,
many ways it
absolutely.
was like kind of a calling for you?
Yeah, it felt that way. Like here, I think most people want to be useful in the world.
Hmm.
They want to contribute something. I think that's basic human nature for most people, certainly for me. And so, similarly to when I was thinking, what do I want to do in my life? You're always looking for how can I be useful? And I thought, okay, I this is something that I'm referring to this book project here. This is
Hmm.
something I could do. I have the skills to do it. I can read. I can gather information. I always felt I could write pretty well. So I can do this. Fine, I'll take it on. And there were times when I just couldn't believe that it was such an obvious thing to do. I couldn't believe nobody else had done it. Like, why, how me? I mean, how did I get this gig? I'm so lucky. And because it was never my full-time job, it was probably, from the start to the finish, it was probably 30 years.
Hmm.
I'd go 6 months without touching it because I was just so busy with other things. But it just, okay, somebody's going to come along and publish. Somebody's got to be working on this. But anyway,
Hmm.
I was lucky, lucked out.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if luck necessarily is the motivating factor behind it. I think there's probably some deep intention behind the universe and the reason why
Mm.
it fell upon your shoulders and why you did it, as you know. Uh, and so I'm curious now when you reflect upon your your entire journey and you go to MIU, but which by the way you commit to 1 year. It's a good thing they didn't ask you to commit to 43 years because that may have been a little bit scarier.
Yeah.
Um, but you commit to the 1 year and now you're here 43 years later. I'm curious how have you noticed Dharma play a role in your life and how has that shifted your role in MIU and in your family life and all this stuff? How have you seen that shifted over time as well?
Good question. When I first came here, I had the opportunity right away to develop a writing course. At the time, for the first decades of the university, the program for the first year, for the freshman year, was called the core course program. This is a wonderful historical footnote, but and the core course program was a set of courses 1 or 2 weeks long. Each course was on some different field that we had a major
Mm,
in, even some courses that we didn't. So by the time you get to the end of the first year, you've had courses in astronomy and business and literature and chemistry and biology and physics and art and so on. And it was great while it lasted. Um, anyway, that was in place. And when I arrived, right before school was about to start, some people who had developed the writing core course had left the university and there was nobody to teach it. So that fell in my lap to do. I had no
mm.
qualifications. I was here, I had a bachelor's degree. Sure, I'll do it. And another guy, and so we did it. And then right away, so this is another thing that this totally dropped in my lap. I came here ready to do anything, whatever. I just want to be at MIU, whatever it is, I'll do it. This dropped in my lap, and I immediately saw ways that that course could be improved. And so then for my first 8 years at the university, I became a professor of composition, worked my way up that ladder and got a master's degree from the University of Iowa in writing. That's a big
Mm.
college for, for university for writing, and ended up giving many presentations at national meetings of, writing teacher association. So it was like a real great, and I loved teaching, absolutely loved it. So, um, and during those early years, every one of those core courses had a writing component in it that I helped develop. So really writing across the curriculum. So that was a wonderful thing for 8 or 9 years. Helped start a master's in professional writing, taught a course called The Teaching of Writing. Um, and that could have been my life until the president of the university asked me to become the dean of students because the, the existing dean of students was moving on to some other job. So as much as I loved this thing, the president asked, sure, I'll do it. So I became the dean of students. So it was a complete shift from
Mm.
academia and teaching into administration. And then from there, I conceived the idea of creating a press within the university, a publishing house. We were beginning to publish some things that's integrated into, a formal academic press. So I conceived that idea and led that for 8 or 9 years. And then the president asked me to become the dean of faculty of all things. And then I became the executive vice president. So the journey was like academia and then dean of students and then, mostly administration since then. Um, but the common thread was just writing under that. And writing to me is a form of teaching in a way. I mean, not in a didactic way, but I knew that I had some knowledge that I wanted to share. So writing became my way to do it. And I guess I was pretty good in administration for the things that I did. Um, I wouldn't call that, I wouldn't immediately say that that was dharmic for me, but
Mm.
um, I guess in hindsight, maybe I enjoyed that as much as just teaching the same class year after year or something, same
Mm.
kind of classes. Anyway, why reflect on it? Because that's the way it worked out. So
Mm.
I'm trying to find a way now to, and so Dharma, I don't know, Dylan, it all, I mean, my Dharma was to somehow, the ultimate Dharma for me was just be on the fastest path of evolution I could find.
Mm.
And that began with TM practice. And then I always looked at being at MIU as like a super advanced technique. I'm transcending every day, but during the day, I'm doing something that's related to that, that's helping advance that in some way. So I just
Mm.
looked at that as sort of hitching my star to this advanced techniques. I've done a lot of different things that may or may not have been dharmic within that on a relative level, but the big dharma was just kind of that. And now I'm trying to find a way to dial back the administration a little bit, dial up the time for writing, because I have 5 or 6 books in the pipeline, and I feel, as vigorous as I've ever felt. I know I won't last forever, so I just want to birth those 5 or 6 books, as quickly as I can.
Mm. Yeah. And it seems to me in hearing you talk like evolution is a holistic process, and so it's not just the technique that you have, but it ends up when you're really following this path, it ends up seeping into every part of your life. Everything you're doing is in
Mm,
evolutionary in some way. So, there's all these different, forms of yoga. You could say like bhakti yoga, karma yoga, and so I'm sure you could find you could label each thing that you do in your life as one of these forms of yoga, like I'm doing administration. It helps the university and I'm good at it. I don't necessarily feel like, incredibly fulfilled by it, but in many ways you're doing service, you're doing something that
that's
needs to
it.
be done. And it's
Yeah,
not something that you would choose to do, perhaps, if you had the choice, but that's okay because service isn't always something that we'd prefer to just probably be at home and eating ice cream than like volunteering somewhere, but volunteering is good because it helps people and it helps with our evolution
yeah.
because of that.
No, there's just been, yeah, as I said earlier, despite all the different kinds of things, on the surface, underneath that, it's just a bedrock of joy. Like, God,
Mm.
I'm just, and just that,
Yeah.
buoyed by that, just like, this is great. How fortunate I am. What a lucky life I've had.
That's amazing to hear. I love that. So I mean, before we go, do you want to talk about any of the books you have in the pipeline? You said 5 or 6 books. Is there anything
Yeah, sure.
exciting?
Yeah, well, I'm excited by them all.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a book that is within a few months of publishing. So just as The Supreme Awakening is about higher states of consciousness, I have a book called Floating Saints, which is about levitation.
Hmm.
And as with The Supreme Awakening, the first part of this book, Floating Saints, travels around the world throughout time, throughout different cultures, and finds accounts of people who could float and fly through the air. And I know that people, I've given presentations on that. I know that people love those kinds of stories in the same way that they like these historical accounts of higher states. So that's the first part, to really show that this, if there's anything, that this is universally reported. Let's put it that way: the ability to float or fly in the air. And you might say, well, that's all just a product of imagination. People in every culture can imagine that they could fly. But in fact, in Western Europe, with the whole procedure of canonization in the Catholic Church, that involves rigorous, early in the process of canonization, there's a whole thing of gathering information about the person's life. Are they worthy of sainthood? And that's where reports that the person could float or fly came out. And there's rigorous cross-examination of that. Rigorous. The Catholic Church is not looking for fabricated stories. And so when you look at these records and look at how that's been done, it's pretty convincing that people who said they saw people sitting in the air, that's what they saw. You can't mistake that. And then that lends credence to all the other stories from around the world who may not have had that rigorous kind of Western left-brained process. That gives some credence there. But then the second half of the book is looking at the few historians who've had the courage to take these things seriously. What do they say? What is the experience during the experience of levitation? What are people experiencing internally? There are a few people who've described that experience. And guess what? It's the experience of transcending. We know a lot about that experience today. What would be the physics that would explain how somebody could violate the laws of gravity, like that? Other special abilities that have been universally reported that are related to flying. In every culture, along with flying, there are lists of other abilities, paranormal abilities, the ability to understand what somebody else is thinking, the ability to know what's going to happen in the future. And it turns out that those abilities have been rigorously researched and documented for the last 140 years anyway. So, so that's one book. And
That's really
it's
exciting.
filled with beautiful watercolor paintings of illustrating some of the stories that I had commissioned. So I'm really excited about that. Next book after that, and so that's really close to being done. And I have no idea how it's so close because I have no writing, as I said, writing's never been part of my job description. Another book that's quite close is called Transcendent Christianity. And like I've never felt like I was raised in the Christian church. Methodist was my parents' um, you know denomination. Didn't like it that much, didn't resonate with me that much. But somehow when I thought, I'm going to take what I did with the Supreme Awakening and I'm just going to like put that whole kind of lens on top of Christianity. And when I started doing that, of all the books, that one is for some reason very dear to me. And when you know what you're looking for, you find transcendence all over the place. In Jesus' teaching, in all of the stories that he told, in the different parts of his life. There different parts of his life are symbolic of from his baptism to his crucifixion, all symbolizing transcending the virtues that he taught of love and so on, charity and so on, how those are fulfilled through the experience of transcending. So that's a chapter on transcending in the Jewish tradition, because Jesus was a Jew. He came out of that. And in the Jewish tradition, you find it. So that one is really precious to me, that book. Those are a couple.
I look forward to reading these. So hopefully with it at some point this year we'll be able to read the first one you mentioned, the
Yeah, if I'm
levitating.
lucky, by the end of the summer, it should be out. Things always take longer than I imagine, always. Even when I try to control for the fact that I always underestimate the time something's going to take, even so, it
It's
takes longer.
it's all right. They say you can't rush perfection, so
Uh,
well, Craig Pearson, it's been very nice, very lovely having you. I think this was a great conversation, and I'm just so pleased to hear you talk about uh, your experience writing the Supreme Awakening and everything leading up to that. I think I can tell it's something you're very passionate about, very interested in, and something that you're meant to write about and talk about. So
mm,
that's awesome.
feels that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks back to you, Dylan. You're an excellent host and interviewer. Um, Appreciate that very much, and good luck with this whole series.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, hopefully they all go as smooth as this one.
All right.
All right. Well, I'll see you around.
All right. Take
Thank you.
care. Okay.
Bye. Okay. That was the interview with Craig Pearson. I hope you enjoyed it. I sure did. It was a good one. I have to admit that I actually don't I don't go back and watch or listen to the interviews beyond just like the cursory glance that I do whenever I'm compiling the whole video together. So I don't know. Maybe I remember it being a good one, but I was also there, so maybe my perspective is flawed. No, but it was good. I'm just gonna say that right now. And if I have to go back and watch it to prove it, then actually I'm not that insecure. I'm not gonna go back and watch it just to prove that it was good. It was good, and I hope you enjoyed. He's a great guy. He's an awesome person to talk to, and I really look forward, and I hope you do too, look forward to reading his new books. I think he mentioned one about the teachings of Christ or just Christian teachings and kind of connecting that to some vague science, which is something I'm really passionate about. So I look forward to reading his book because he kind of did the work that I didn't have to do. I was going back through the Old Testament for some time. I was reading it page for page, um, and it's really dense. It's a big read, so I kind of lost steam and gave up a little bit. And the whole point of reading it was kind of to make the connections between my paradigm of how I view the universe and what is extolled in this old book. But he's kind of done it for me, at least with the New Testament and teachings of Jesus. So that's great. Go ahead and read that. But that was another episode of Seek and Tell, episode 3 in the can. We're getting better. At each episode, we're learning. So episode 4, I'm just gonna say now, it's gonna be a good one. It's gonna be a good one. So until then, my name is Dylan McDonald. This has been the Seek and Tell podcast. We're signing off, and we'll see you next time. Love you. Bye.